2 Samuel 10. Second Samuel chapter 10. Let's go ahead and read through this. Verse 1, it says, "And it came to pass after this, that the king of the children of Ammon died, and Hanun his son reigned in his stead. And then said David, I will show kindness unto Hanun the son of Nahash, as his father showed kindness unto me. And David sent to comfort him by the hand of his servants for his father. And David's servants came into the land of the children of Ammon. And the princes of the children of Ammon said unto Hanun their lord, Thinkest thou that David doth honor thy father, that he does not, or that he hath sent comforters unto thee? Hath not David rather sent his servants unto thee to search the city, and to spy it out, and to overthrow it? Wherefore Hanun took David's servants, and shaved off the one half of their beards, and cut off their garments in the middle even to their buttocks, and sent them away. And when they told it unto David, he sent to meet them, because the men were greatly ashamed. And the king said, Tarry at Jericho until your beards be grown, and then return. And when the children of Ammon saw that they stank before David, the children of Ammon sent and hired the Syrians of Beth-rehob, and the Syrians of Zobah, 20,000 footmen, and of the king of Maacah 1,000 men, and of Ishtob 12,000 men. And when David heard of it, he sent Joab and all the host of the mighty men. And the children of Ammon came out, and they put the battle in array at the entering into the gate. And the Syrians of Zobah, and of Rehob, and of Ishtob, and of Maacah were by themselves in the field. And when Joab saw that the front of the battle was against him before and behind, he chose all of the choice men of Israel and put them in array against the Syrians. And the rest of the people he delivered into the hand of Abishai his brother, that he might put them in array against the children of Ammon. And he said, If the Syrians be too strong for me, then thou shalt help me. But if the children of Ammon be too strong for thee, then I will come to help thee. Be of good courage, and let us play the men for our people and for the cities of our God, and the Lord do that which seemeth him good. And Joab drew nigh, and the people that were with him, unto the battle against the Syrians, and they fled before him. And when the children of Ammon saw that the Syrians were fled, then they fled also before Abishai, and entered into the city. And so Joab returned from the children of Ammon, and came to Jerusalem. And when the Syrians saw that they were smitten before Israel, they gathered themselves together. And Hadarezer sent and brought out the Syrians that were beyond the river. Helam, the captain of the host of Hadarezer, went before them. And when it was told David, he gathered all Israel together, and passed over Jordan, and came to Helam. And the Syrians set themselves in array against David, and fought with him. And the Syrians fled before Israel. And David slew the men of 700 chariots out of the Syrians, and 40,000 horsemen, and smote Shobach the captain of their host, who died there. And when all the kings that were servants to Hadarezer saw that they were smitten before Israel, they made peace with Israel and served them. And so the Syrians feared to help the children of Ammon anymore. And so what we have here in chapter 10 is essentially the setup. Chapter 10 is a setup for chapters 11 and 12. And so this section of Scripture is leading us to the great sin of David with Bathsheba, because the Ammonite wars are the setting for that sin. And so chapter 10 then really, obviously it serves a historical function because these wars did happen. From a historical narrative perspective, everything that was said in chapter 10 is true, good, and right. But functionally, narratively, what it is doing is it's setting us up. It's giving us the reason why David was at the castle, why he was not with it. Like everything in this chapter is setting up chapter 11. Now, there's an interesting a narrative thing that is happening, and I'll be honest with you, I haven't wrapped my mind around what the author of Samuel is doing with this. But it is interesting that he does it in two places. And so interestingly, the two stories of David's victories over the Ammonites bookend the Bathsheba narrative. And so chapter 10, we have the victories over the Ammonites, and it will happen again at the end of chapter 12. And so you have victory over Ammonites, the story of David and Bathsheba, and then victory over the Ammonites. The same kind of thing happened in 1 Samuel, where two stories of David's sparing Saul's life bookend the Abigail narrative. And so you have David sparing Saul, the Abigail story, David sparing Saul. Again, I don't know what exactly the author of Samuel is doing by this particular technique, but it seems clear that he's doing something with it, and there's some kind of narrative technique being displayed here. I just don't know what that is, but I find it interesting that he does it both in 1 Samuel with the story of David and Abigail, which obviously is not the exact same as David and Bathsheba, but it does still include this a story of David adding to his list of wives, and obviously we know more about Abigail and Bathsheba than really the others, except for, I guess you could say, Micah. But nevertheless, there's clearly something taking place there with this, the way in which it is written. However, with all that said, before we see him fall, which that's coming in the next chapter, we see him rise, and that happens here in chapter 10. And so the king of Ammon, which was Nahash, had died, and now his son Hanan was now taking the throne. Now, Nahash, it's been a long time since we talked about this, but early on in Saul's reign, Nahash had attacked, and really probably the better word for that would be besieged, Jabesh-Gilead. And if you remember, Jabesh-Gilead kind of went back and forth with the Ammonites, and there was some decisions being made there, and nothing was looking good for Jabesh-Gilead, and somehow Saul hears about what is taking place there, and Saul comes down and he delivers Jabesh-Gilead, and that was one instance where in the beginning of Saul's reign, he really was doing things right. He started off as a good king. And so even though there was strained relationships, is maybe a weak way to say that, but there was obviously some kind of difficulties there between Israel and Ammon with Saul. Apparently at some point David had corrected that. David and Nahash had some degree of a friendly relationship, because David sends to his son and he says, as his father showed kindness unto me. And so this is, again, we're not told this. We don't know how that came to pass. But David, for all of the things that David was, another thing that David was a diplomat. He was good at politics. We've discussed a little bit of that in 1 Samuel, but we've seen it here in 2 Samuel as well. David was good at what he did, and that's not a bad thing. It's not bad that David was good at diplomacy. And so, in fact, I would add that what he does here with Hanan is equal parts genuine and diplomacy. I don't think we have to separate the two. And so hearing that Nahash had died, David sends some servants. He sends some servants to Hanan to comfort him, number one, and also to let him know, I will show kindness unto Hanan, the son of Nahash, as his father showed kindness unto me. Again, I don't see any reason that we need to necessarily say this was completely David just being genuinely comforting to Hanan, or that this is David just playing the role of diplomat and trying to make sure that those good relations continued with the nation of Ammon. I think it's both, and I don't think it's wrong for it to be both. Again, David was good at what he did. However, the problem started coming into play when Hanan listens to bad advice. And it's interesting that there are so many stories in the Bible where that's the impetus, that tragic and horrible things take place because somebody in leadership had bad people around them and listened to bad advice. It happens all the time. And it's just another reason why we need to be careful about who we listen to, who we allow to influence us. This kind of thing happens regularly, particularly in the Old Testament. But Hanan knew on the throne his advisors, and we don't know if these were new advisors. We don't know if these were carryovers from his father's reign. We're not given that information. But nevertheless, Hanan is listening to these guys, and these guys come to him and say, listen, do you really think David sent these guys over just to give you some comfort? Do you really think that that's what he's doing? No, let's be honest, Hanan. Let's be clear about this. David sent these guys over here for one purpose. They're here to spy out our country so that they can overthrow it. That's the only reason why they're here. We know that's not true. We know that's not why David sent them. But Hanan, obviously Hanan doesn't really know David. At least that's the assumption. And so he trusts these men. He believes them. He gives in to this. And so in response to this, what he does is he takes these men that David had sent. He shaves off half of their beard. He doesn't shave off their whole beard. He shaves off half of their beard. And we might think, well, what's the big deal with this? You have to understand the relationship between Jewish men and their beards. It was a very, holy might be too strong a word, but it was a very serious thing for a Jewish man to have a beard, and there were There were laws in the Mosaic Code as for what they could do with their beards and the way that they were to keep their beards. And so to shave that off was an affront to them, but also it was making them unclean. And so there were religious implications in this. This is, again, we might not think that this is such a big deal. This is a tremendously big deal. And then add on top of that, the fact that they cut off, in verse 4, they cut off their garments in the middle. And when it says there, even to the buttocks, that's the way for the Bible to show us in a way that gives decorum to say that they exposed these men. That's the point. And so what is happening here, again, to try and make this as clean as we can here, is that the king not only shaves them, but he sends them back exposed, allowing the Gentiles around to see the circumcision of these men, because that was a source of derision. That was a source of affliction, and this was a means to shame them. Right? That's ultimately what is happening, is that the king is shaming these men. David knows that. They know it. The king knows that. Everybody knows it. The second he did this, his intentions were made very, very clear. Any chance of good political relationship with David was ended the second he did this. And so he sends these men back. They come back. David sees them. He sends them, and he stations them at Jericho. And essentially he stations them at Jericho to give them the chance to have their beards grow back before they come home, before they, be reintegrated into normal everyday life. And again, that was a very important thing. That was the right thing for David to do. Well, it seems, verse 6, it's kind of an interesting transition. And so they do this. Hanan does this, sends them back, shames them, and then verse 6, and when the children of Ammon saw that they stank before David. By this point, we're not told that David had made any retaliation yet. But the Ammonites it's almost like they sat there and just kind of started contemplating what they had done, thinking not only about what they had done, but who they had done it against. Again, David was well known for his prowess, for his military implications, and so they began to think about this, and they began to understand, we've really messed up here. We shouldn't have done this. And so they begin to think about this, and they begin to fear the response. And they had to know that something was coming, right? They began to fear a response from David. And so what they do is they start reaching out and making alliances. And so they're reaching out to the nations that are kind of on the northeastern side of Israel, and they form this coalition mainly with the Syrians. And so they get 20,000 men from Beth Rehob and Zobah, both Syrian nations. They get 1,000 men from Maacah. They get another 12,000 from Ishtab. They're forming a massive fighting force. Again, this is in conjunction with their own forces. They form this massive fighting force to come against what they know is going to be the retaliation of David. And so David, interestingly enough, again, by this point, I think we could safely assume David would have done something. But we're not told about that. But we are told that once he hears about this, now he must act. He's kind of almost forced into it. And so he hears about this, and he sends Joab. And he sends Joab and all the host of the mighty men. And so the mighty men of Israel were the most elite fighting force that they had. It would be, kind of akin to the president today sending out the Navy SEALs and the Delta Force and the Green Berets. Let's take the elite of the elites, and we'll send them out and we'll let them do the job. And so he gets all of the host of the mighty men. He puts them under his right-hand man, Joab, and he says, essentially, go take care of this. And so you have the Ammonite coalition against David's best fighting force. And honestly, it's not a fight. David he has trained his men well. They know what they're doing. He has the best forces. And so what happens is the Ammonites and the Syrians, even though they had formed this coalition, they kind of split their forces. And so they send the Syrians and their forces one way, and they send the Ammonites another way. And Joab essentially realizes we've been surrounded. And so what he does then is Joab takes the best of the best. So now you have the elites of the elites of the elites. Joab takes the best of the mighty men with himself to fight the kind of better and more experienced Syrian army. And he sends the rest of the mighty men with his brother Abishai. And so one takes the north, one takes the south, and they make this agreement. If you need help, we'll come help you. If we need help, you come help us. The assumption, and what's interesting about that is the built-in assumption in Joab's mind is that we're not going to both fail. Right? We'll be victorious one way or another. Either you're going to be victorious and then come help us, or we'll be victorious and then come help you. And so this was the built-in assumption in Joab's mind, is that victory was going to be had. And so we see this conversation going forth between him and Abishai, obviously coming to a head in verse 12. Be of good courage, and let us play them in for our people and for the cities of our God. And then he says this, and the Lord do that which seemeth him good. And so they end with on the right note. And so ultimately, and I'm going to come back to that thought in just a second, ultimately God grants them a decided victory. And what's interesting about this chapter is that, kind of unlike a lot of the battles that we have seen in 1 and 2 Samuel, we get no details about the actual battle itself. And so there's two battles that take place in this chapter. We don't get details about any of them. And so in verse 13, Joab drew nigh, and the people that were with him unto the battle of the Syrians, and they fled. And so we don't know exactly what happened. We don't know how long the battle took place. We don't know how many people died. We just know that there was a battle, and the Syrians ultimately flee. And then that leads in verse 14, that the children of Ammon saw the Syrians flee, and so then they flee. And so again, we don't know how much fighting actually took place. We don't get any of the details. We just know that ultimately God grants the victory to Israel. And so the fact that we get no details whatsoever about the battles themselves, but then we get kind of the details of the conversation between Joab and his brother, shows where the author is placing the emphasis. And that's important, because the emphasis isn't on the fighting itself. The emphasis then is on what Joab says at the end of verse 12, when the Lord do that which seemeth him good. Here's what the author is telling us. It doesn't matter what happened in the battle. What happened in the battle is what the Lord seemeth to do good. That's what happened. And so from that we can see it doesn't matter how many enemies there are. It doesn't matter what difficulties may lie ahead. Our God is going to do that what seems good to him, which should ultimately be the biggest of comforts to Christians, because we know we serve a good God, right? And so if we serve a good God, and God's going to do what seems good to him, we know that the outcome is going to be good, right? And it might not sometimes look good to us. We might not sometimes understand the outcome, but if it is what God wanted it to be, it is the right outcome. And so this is where Joab and Abishai kind of left the matter, and ultimately that's what happened. And so this is it's interesting the way the author puts this particular section together to emphasize what he emphasizes. And so ultimately what happens is the Syrians flee and the Ammonites flee. At the end of verse 14, it says that they fled before Abishai, they entered into the city, and so Joab returned from the children of Ammon and came to Jerusalem. And so Syrians flee, Ammonites flee, job's done, Joab goes home. That's how it has ended for now. And so we come to verse 15. It says, and when the Syrians saw that they were smitten before Israel, they gathered themselves together. And so they had gathered or joined themselves to Ammon. Didn't go well for them. And so they thought, well, let's get an even better force, and let's do this again, right? We can't let it end this way. And so after their defeat, the Syrians gather an even larger army to be led by this man Shobek, the captain of the host of Hadarezer. And Hadarezer is just an alternate of the name Hadadezer. You see both in the Old Testament. It's the same person. And so once more, David hears about this. It probably wouldn't be too difficult to find out this kind of thing was happening. It's hard to keep something like that silent. And so David hears about this. The difference now is that David personally leads his army this time. So the first time he just sends out Joab. But this time he seems to think, I need to take care of this personally. And so he leads the army. And it says that he gathered all Israel together, not just mighty men. Now he gets everybody. He gets their whole fighting force. He gathers all Israel together, and he passed over Jordan and came to Helam. This is a massive moving force. This is an interesting thing because it's just sort of passed over. Again, we don't get any details, but think about the massive implications of this. The entire army of Israel has just crossed the Jordan and gone into another area to fight a foreign nation. This is a massive undergoing. And so again, the battle is fought, and again, no details are given. It's just the same outcome. There's a battle. We don't know what happened. Ultimately, the Syrians flee. And so the victory was David's, as Israel kills several thousands of the Syrians. That's kind of all the information we get, including Shobek, the captain. Now, with Hadadezer's defeat, all the kings, we see this in verse 19, all the kings who had been servants with him now made peace with Israel, served him. And so this wasn't just a victory for Israel over the Syrians. It was that. It had much bigger implications. It was a victory over the Syrians and over all those who were subservient to Syria. And so they gained a tremendous amount of people's loyalties, governmental power. The implications of this are far, far reaching. And I want to quote Blakey here because he does a good job of bringing out kind of what's in between the lines here. He says, it requires but a very little consideration to see that the wars which are so briefly recorded in this chapter must have been most serious and perilous undertakings. The record of them is so short, so unimpassioned, so simple, that many readers are disposed to think very little of them. But when we pause to think what it was for the king of Israel to meet on foreign soil confederates so numerous, so powerful with warfare, we cannot but see that these were tremendous wars. They were fitted to try the faith as well as the courage of David and his people to the very utmost. And so I want to key in there on that last phrase, that they were fitted to try the faith as well as the courage of David. Again, why does that matter? Why is that important? It matters in and of itself because God does give us tests of our faith consistently, I believe. And so it matters just on that note. But it even has bigger implications considering what's coming. Again, considering chapters 11 and 12, the sin with Bathsheba and the implications of that. God is trying the faith, the courage of David here. And what does he do? He rises to the occasion. He stands up. He brings the battle. He takes his men. He goes in. He leads in the fight, and they're victorious. God grants him the victory. It was a victorious day. I'm sure many celebrations were taking place in Israel. All at this point, if again, kind of if the story of David ended here, it's tremendous. He goes down as one of the, not just greatest leaders of Israel, one of the greatest leaders ever in the history of humanity. And so with all the good things that we have seen. And it's sad to think of the David of chapter 10 becoming the David of chapter 11. And so that's kind of what I want to speak about just for a minute here, because I see the author of Samuel here doing. We saw this a lot in 1 Samuel and not very much in 2 Samuel. We have seen it a little bit. But we talked many, many times in 1 Samuel about the author of Samuel making contrasts. He did this so many times. He would set up characters or situations as contrasts one of the other. And I believe what he's doing here in chapters 10 and 11 is he's doing that again, except this time David is contrasted with himself. And so David, and I think the way he's setting this up, in chapters really 9 and 10, in the last two chapters, we have seen a very impressive David. Let's put it that way. We have seen David, and I was trying to just kind of boil this down. And so I came up with three kind of terms or adjectives that kind of defined, in my mind, the David of the last two chapters. We have seen David as loyal, kind, and victorious. In the last two chapters, remember chapter 9 was David reaching out to Mephibosheth, and he brings in Mephibosheth and lets him eat at his table, and he shows kindness to Saul and Jonathan in particular. He shows a loyalty to the covenant that he had made with Jonathan, and he brings in somebody and shows him kindness and mercy, which we talked about this last week, which nobody else at that particular time would have done. This was not just anybody. This was a rightful heir to the former king, right? And yet Jonathan is loyal to the covenant. He shows kindness. Here in chapter 10, victorious. Victorious in ways that we can't even begin to imagine. It's not just that two armies butted heads with one another and one came out with just a few less losses than the other one. No, two impressive armies fought two times. And Israel was so decisively victorious that the other army fled, right? And so, again, we can't even begin to underscore how victorious David is in chapter 10. And so, in chapters 9 and 10, again, he is loyal, he is kind, he is victorious. And loyal, by the way, I mentioned this briefly in chapter 9, but loyal specifically to a covenant, loyal to a covenant. And then we get to chapter 11, and what do we see? David as disloyal, harsh, and defeated. And so what's coming up, again, we all know the story of David and Bathsheba. He's disloyal. He's disloyal not only to his wives, plural, which we've talked about, why that was wrong, but he's disloyal to the covenant nature of marriage. He's disloyal to that particular covenant when he was so loyal to the covenant he made with Jonathan. And so he's disloyal there. He's harsh. Instead of being kind, we saw him being kind to Mephibosheth. This chapter begins with David reaching out to Hanan, and he says, as I will be kind, I will show kindness as his father showed kindness to me. And so David has been kind to what was, this may be too strong of a term, but what would have been seen in his time as a political enemy in Mephibosheth. And he's shown kindness to a foreign power in Hanan. And yet, when it comes to Uriah, he will show no kindness. Uriah, the innocent man in his own army, fighting for him, he will show no kindness. And then obviously defeated, which, we'll get to the infamous, you are the man, right? David ultimately stands defeated in this particular story. And so, to me, I see no doubt in my mind whatsoever that the author of Samuel is setting up David in chapters 9 and 10 to show what he could have been, fully, and yet ultimately what he became. Now, obviously the story doesn't end there. David does repent, right? It's not as if there's just a falling off never to rise again. David repents of this and becomes a tremendous picture to us of what God can do with a repentant person. Right? David doesn't just wallow in the sin and misery for the rest of his life. He repents and still becomes a great king. And so there's many, many lessons to see in all of that, which we'll get to this. But I want to emphasize again this contrast that is very clearly being made by David to David in chapters 9 and 10 and chapters 11 and 12. And so the chapter, and I mentioned this already, but the chapter ends with unfinished business. Again, the armies, the enemies flee, but they're not conquered. They were defeated, but again, not conquered. And by that I mean defeated, but still able to fight again. And so this is another reason why chapters 11 and 12 take place, because Joab, again, he defeats the Ammonites, but not completely. They flee, but they flee to reorganize, and they flee to gather together an army again. They're hiding in their cities. Joab, instead of pushing it and going and finishing the job, he comes home. He comes back to Jerusalem. And so that battle would soon continue. David would once again send out Joab while he would be free to roam upon the roof of the king's house. And we'll see that in verse 2 of the next chapter. And obviously we understand what happens while he's roaming up there on the roof of his house. And so there's all of this. Again, chapter 10 is... obviously, it's good in its own right. It's scripture in its own right. We don't need chapter 11 for chapter 10 to have meaning. But obviously, chapter 10 is leading us to chapter 11. And there's much to see in this and much to learn from, particularly what's coming in the next couple of chapters. So this is important because we have seen mostly good things with David. We've seen some bad things. It's been almost all good. And it's important for chapters 11 and 12. We talk about consistently how the Bible proves itself over and over again as a work of God and not a work of man. There might not be a portion of Scripture that proves that better than chapters 11 and 12 of 2 Samuel, because David is the hero. He is the ultimate man of God. He's the man after God's own heart. He's the to borrow kind of a common vernacular, he's the chosen one, right? He's the one. He is the guy. And if this was a work of man, we skip over what many people would consider, just some small infidelity. But the Bible doesn't consider it a small infidelity. The Bible considers it a moral failure, a sin, a transgression against the holy God who called him to the position that he was in. And so this is, again, one of the strongest proofs of the fact that this is a work of God and not a work of man. And if it's a work of God, man, it's a work to be studied, a work to be to learn from. So very, very important truths to see coming up. Now, I don't know, I haven't begun to break it down and make the lesson yet, but I don't know if chapter 11 and 12 will just be 2 weeks. We might have to spend a little bit more time there. I don't know yet. I'll know that more in the coming couple of weeks. But nevertheless, I just don't want to pass over things that we maybe need to spend a little bit more time on. But that's what we've got coming up. So let me pray, and we'll be dismissed this morning. Lord, we do thank you, like I just mentioned, for Scripture. We thank you for this very obvious and clear work of God. We thank you that not only